Nintendo makes a lot of games. Over the course of their 35 plus years in the video game making business, they've launched a ton of incredibly memorable titles and franchises, from Super Mario Bros. To The Legend of Zelda to Kirby, Metroid, the list goes on and on. It seems like everything Nintendo puts out at this point is a big deal, even with their new IPs like Splatoon and more recently ARMS. But occasionally, Nintendo will release something that doesn't really stick. Maybe it's a game that never saw a sequel, or maybe it's something that just never saw the light of day outside of Japan. And you know what? I thought it'd be pretty cool to talk about some of these forgotten games. Now, I'm not trying to show off hidden gems here or anything like that. What I really want to do is rekindle that flame that's been out in that brain of yours for so long. You know, jog your memory a bit. And hopefully when you see some of these games, you'll be like, oh, yeah, that's a thing, I totally forgot about it. Or maybe you just never heard of them, I don't know. There is one caveat here though. The games don't have to be developed internally at Nintendo. As long as they published it and owned the franchise, I'm gonna say it counts. Something like Wonderful 101 would be okay, but Bayonetta 2, for example, wouldn't count even though Nintendo published it, since Sega still owns the IP. So with that out of the way, let's get started with the game that made me want to do this in the first place. Steel Diver. Yeah, remember this? Ah, Steel Diver. It'll forever be known as that one 3DS launch title with submarines. But Steel Diver actually has a much longer history than that. It started out as a tech demo for the original Nintendo DS because Miyamoto apparently wanted to make a flight simulator, and I guess a sub-simulator was the next best thing. After that DS tech demo though, there was no word of it until E3 2010 when Steel Diver resurfaced for the 3DS. I'm so sorry. I had no idea what to think of it at the time, but I decided to pick it up at launch with my 3DS as it was pretty slim pickings. What I got was a languid, slow-moving, short experience, and I kinda liked it. Steel Diver is strange. It's not something you see at first glance and think, this looks like fun. It's got a couple different modes, but the main one is the mission mode where you have to pilot your boat through multiple levels while dodging other submarines and missiles. A lot of the enjoyment I got with Steel Diver comes from controlling the 3 different submarines you have at your disposal. You've got these dials for forward and reverse movement as well as surfacing and diving down. While it is slow, it's also very methodical at the same time. The vessels also feel super weighty and each one feels completely different. First off, you've got the Serpent, the largest sub of the bunch. It's hard to keep control of the thing, but what it lacks in maneuverability, it makes up for in speed and firepower. The Serpent can fire 4 missiles at once, and there's a crank wheel you can use to adjust the angle that it's moving at. Then there's the Blue Shark, which is the most well-rounded of the 3. It can only fire 2 missiles, but it's easier to maneuver than the Serpent, and you're still able to adjust the angle of the boat. Finally, there's the Manatee, the smallest and easiest ship to maneuver. The big difference with the Manatee is that you can't adjust its angle manually. That all depends on what direction you're moving and how quickly. It can also shoot missiles vertically, which is a huge help in some of the later levels. Learning how to best utilize each sub in each level is what really makes Steel Diver worth playing. Like I said though, it's pretty short with only 7 different missions with varying locations and difficulties. There are some bosses in a few levels as well to change things up, but after you beat the 7 missions, you do unlock a hard mode if that's your type of thing. After finishing levels, there's also an interesting little mini-game called Periscope Strike where you can spin around in your chair to use the gyro sensor and shoot down ships. You get decals that you can use to help you in the mission mode, but other than that, it's just kind of a fun distraction. If for some reason you only want to play Periscope Strike though, there is a mode specifically for that. The last mode in Steel Diver is Steel Commander, which is basically just a modified version of Battleship. I barely spent any time with this mode, but maybe it could be fun? You'd think after Steel Diver so quickly came and went that would be it for the franchise, but surprisingly, Nintendo released a successor in the free-to-play eShop exclusive Steel Diver Sub Wars, a first-person submarine shooter? And Peppy Hare makes a cameo? Okay, sure. It's got a mission mode too, but the main attraction here was the online multiplayer. Most of the same mechanics from the first game are there, but now it's in first person. Somehow I found a couple players online which I did not expect and proceeded to kick Sonic 87650's ass. I think Sonic was playing the wrong game, it's a little too slow for him. I guess Sub Wars is decent for what it is, but I wouldn't ever pay for the full version. Submarines are cool and all with their ability to travel underwater, but you know it can travel underground? Well, a lot of things, but also moles. Let's take a look at Mole Mania, another game from the mind of Miyamoto. While I'd probably call Steel Diver a guilty pleasure of mine, Mole Mania is just a straight up good video game. Released in February of 1997 for the Game Boy, Mole Mania came out at a weird time. The Game Boy itself was kinda losing its legs, and over in Japan everyone was caught up in the Pokemon craze that would soon hit the US as well. Unfortunately, this meant Mole Mania was completely overlooked back then and continues to be overlooked today. It's a shame the game itself has been forgotten over the years, but the bigger crime may be how little spotlight the badass main character Muddy Mole gets these days. Yeah, you better watch out, Monty, there's a cooler mole in town. Muddy's just trying to make ends meet with his wife and kids, but as things begin, his entire family gets kidnapped by a farmer named Jinby. Like, I get it, Muddy's been stealing all your vegetables, but kidnapping a blind mole's menage is a bit much, isn't it? Needless to say, as any good mole would do, Muddy soon heads out to get some revenge, and maybe some cabbage too. Mole Mania is a puzzle title where you have to use your wits to make your way through multiple maze-like levels. Muddy can push, pull, and throw objects, but the one big mechanic that really sets Mania apart is that special ability moles have: burrowing. This adds a lot of depth to what may seem like fairly simple design at first. Every time you burrow down or pop back up, a hole is created on the surface which can either help or hinder you depending on the situation. Thankfully, you can always take a peek above ground without completely jumping up and creating a hole. And I gotta say, Mole Mania gets extremely hard as you keep playing. The first couple levels start out easy enough, but new mechanics are constantly thrown your way, like spikes you can't walk across, objects you can only push, not pull, and barrels that fill in holes that could possibly block your path underground. I got stuck on multiple occasions just staring at the screen wondering what I should do. When you do eventually figure out the right path though, it's super satisfying, and to me, that's the sign of a good puzzler. Each level has its own secrets, and at the end of the levels, there's always a fun boss to add some more variety. Those cabbages I mentioned earlier also work as extra collectibles that add to your total score. Mole Mania is a perfect portable game. It looks good, it sounds good, and it plays great. It's available on the 3DS eShop for just a few bucks, so give Muddy some love if you can. Hopefully we'll see more of him at some point in the future. Let's move on to some more obscure stuff now. With the recent release of ARMS, I thought it'd be fun to look at one of the first fighting games Nintendo ever put out. No, not Urban Champion, Joy Mech Fight. Joy Mech Fight was only released in Japan, and it's pretty easy to see why. By the time it came out on the Famicom in 1993, most people had moved on to the Super Nintendo, which had been out for a full 2 years at that point. Those people were also probably playing bigger and better things like Street Fighter 2, and it kind of feels like Joy Mech Fight was trying to capitalize on the popularity of those early 90s fighters. JMF did try to differentiate itself a bit though by having at least some sort of a story mode, which was not common for fighting games at the time. The story starts out with two friends who love making robots, Little Ermin and Ivan Warner. These guys look suspiciously like younger versions of two other makers of robots you may have seen before, but I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Unfortunately, one day, one of these friends, you probably know which one, goes off the deep end and decides to steal and create an army of robots. Ermin obviously can't stand for this and decides to make a robot of his own named Sukopon to fight Ivan's army. At first, Sukopon is the only robot available for you to play, but after defeating the first 8 robots Ivan throws at you, you'll be able to use more. As you make your way through the horde of robots Ivan has at his disposal, you'll eventually end up on the moon somehow to take on his ultimate robot. After you beat him, Ivan tries to make his great escape, only to lose control and crash his ship. And then he dies. On the moon. We killed him. Nah, he's fine. Ermin saves him, and everything goes back to normal, somehow. Joy Mech Fight admirably tries to emulate a lot of the things Street Fighter 2 brought on with its controls, but there was only so much the devs could do on an aging 8-bit system with only 2 buttons to work with. What's there though is pretty impressive. Each character has 4 special moves that can be achieved using directional inputs, simultaneous button presses, or quickly tapping a certain button. You've also got your normal punches and kicks as would be expected, and there's also a huge roster of 36 playable characters. They're all the robots you go up against in the story mode. Unlocking them isn't easy, and a lot of them are clones, but for the time, a roster of that size was unheard of. Unfortunately, the actual fighting isn't that great. It all works well enough, but hitboxes are a little wonky and the overall feel just isn't there. It's really cool to see how Nintendo tried to handle a true fighting game on the Famicom, but I think it's safe to say we didn't miss out on too much by never getting a localization. And I don't think Nintendo really cares either. The only time they ever acknowledged the game outside of Japan was when they added Sukopon as a sticker in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Oh well. We've seen giant boats and giant robots so far, but how about we get a look at what an actual giant can do? Anybody remember Doshin the Giant? Created by Kazutoshi Ida, Doshin the Giant has a very interesting past, much like Steel Diver. When Ida began developing video games, he knew he only ever wanted to create 3 titles. He wanted to make abstract games where the player would end up understanding things as they went along, and Doshin the Giant ended up being his 3rd and final release. It was originally sold in Japan on the Nintendo 64 disk drive, and it even got an expansion on the N64 DD, even though the add-on was by all accounts a failure. Looking to find a new audience, Nintendo decided to port Doshin onto the Gamecube in Europe and Japan, but for some reason skipped the North American market. So, Doshin the Giant is really weird. It's a god game where you play as none other than that happy yellow giant himself, Doshin. You're the local god, and your task is to help the islanders with everything they need. You can pick up people and move trees around, but the coolest thing Doshin can do is terraform the entire world to help satiate the desires of all the needy villagers. This aspect seems like it was obviously added to show off the technical capabilities of the N64 DD at the time, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't fun. And I mean, Doshin does this cool little shimmy whenever he's changing things up. How can you not like that? As you continue to complete tasks, and if you do a good job, the island folk will praise you, sending hearts your way. After you earn a certain amount of hearts, Doshin will grow bigger. This doesn't really seem to affect anything in the game itself, but it's a good indicator of how much progress you've made in that day. After each day is over, Doshin heads back to where he came from and comes back the following day for a fresh start. Once you do enough, islanders will also start building monuments, which is the main goal. While terraforming the world is neat at first, things soon get a little too repetitive for my tastes. You'll be doing the same tasks over and over again, but just in different areas. It doesn't help that Doshin is kind of a slow giant, so getting around the world isn't exactly quick either. At some point, I got a bit bored and decided I'd see what lies along the edge of the map. I thought, hey, maybe the day would end or I'd hit an invisible wall. It turns out you fall. You fall straight down and die. Game over. It was at this point that I realized Doshin the Giant wasn't worth playing anymore. Oh, and I guess now's a good time to mention you can turn into an evil version of Doshin and destroy everything. It's way more fun. Speaking of destroying everything, specifically giants, the last game we're going to check out lets you do exactly that. It's time for some Zangeki no Reginleiv. Zangeki no Reginleiv was an unexpected collaboration between Nintendo and Sandlot for the Wii. If that second name sounds familiar, it's because they're the developers of the cult favorite Earth Defense Force series, and much like EDF, Reginleiv boasts an absolutely ridiculous amount of insanity, just without the ballistic weapons and insects. It also seems to have a far greater emphasis on story, which amounts to just like defend the Earth in EDF. But sadly, because I don't understand Japanese, I have no idea what's going on, so I'm mostly just going to stick with what Zangeki offers in terms of gameplay. I can't say the story seems pretty intense though, going by the generous amount of dramatic cutscenes. And according to my sources out there, it's based on Norse mythology, which I think is pretty damn cool. So I'm gonna get this out of the way right off the bat. I love Zangeki no Reginleiv. It's really ugly, there are constant frame drops and the gameplay gets monotonous, but I just don't care. It's got all the same issues that Earth Defense Force has, but all the same things that I love about that series too. It's just a whole lot of dumb, stupid fun. I mean, are you seeing this? Are you watching what's happening right now? Alright, okay, I feel like that's all you really need to see, but let me try and go into a little more detail. There are 2 playable characters in Zangeki no Reginleiv, Frey and Freya. They're like gods or something that can turn into hawks. I don't know, it's weird, but anyway, both of them have certain unique weapon types that they can use. For example, only Frey can use hammers, but Freya can use magic staffs and bows that can lock onto multiple targets. These magic weapons can't be abused though, as you'll need to have the mana to work with. Freya can also equip 3 pieces of equipment, while Frey can only use 2. And while we're on the topic of weapons, I should mention that there are a lot of them to choose from. Like, over 300. Unlike Earth Defense Force though, where you pick up random weapons that downed enemies drop, Zangeki no Reginleiv allows you to purchase weapons through a weapon tree. How do you buy them though? Well, in every level, the monsters you fight will unload fountains of gems and other pickups that are used towards buying new weapons. The tougher an enemy is, the more you'll be rewarded. Leveling up your characters is also done with these same pickups, so you'll have to use them wisely. And of course, as you make your way down the weapon tree, things will become more expensive, but also more effective. Even if you want to, you won't be able to make it through the campaign using only one character. Progression is done through a level-based system. There are some levels that you can pick either character to play as, but at some points in the story, the levels branch off into a side for Frey and a side for Freya. And while this is most likely done so that players get a chance to experiment with each character, it also makes sense within the story as the two warriors do actually go their separate ways. There are also times where using one character over another is more beneficial too. Like, these flying dragon enemies that travel in groups are way easier to take out with Freya's lock-on bows, and the sheer power of Frey's weapons gives him an easier time taking down the much larger monsters. So you've got your characters and all your weapons. How do you go about actually controlling everything? Well, this is on the Wii, so motion controls are a solid assumption. But the controls in Zangeki no Reginleiv actually work surprisingly well. It was one of the first titles to require the use of Wii Motion Plus, and it shows. Your swipes and swings all feel extremely accurate and register how you'd want them to. Some weapons like the hammer or greatsword are slower and actually paint a little blue line on the screen showing you exactly where you attacked. These heavier weapons give the game a little bit of a Monster Hunter feel with the deliberate movement and timing required. Using the bows also feels pretty good and has a similar control scheme to the archery mode in Wii Sports Resort. This may not be ideal in the heat of battle, but I never felt like I was too hindered because of the controls. The one big issue I do have with the controls though is the dodge mechanic. Dodging is pulled off with the shake of the nunchuck, but there are 8 different directions you can dodge in. Anyone who's ever used a nunchuck controller on the Wii knows that it's not exactly the most accurate piece of technology, so it gets very frustrating when you try to dodge one way only to go a completely different direction. Not to mention, you move faster if you constantly dodge, so you'll be shaking your nunchuck a lot. Zangeki is a really fun game to play by yourself, but it was even more fun with up to 4 friends online, much like EDF. The online campaign was also completely different from the single-player one, but unfortunately it's not possible to play those online missions anymore as the Nintendo Wi-Fi service for the Wii has been shut down. But that shouldn't stop you from trying Reginleiv if you have the means to do so, especially if you're a fan of the Earth Defense Force franchise. It's just a complete spectacle as there are so many crazy enemies to fight and taking them down feels great. There are even some neat mechanics in there as well, like how giants will keep fighting even after you've severed multiple limbs. It's totally jank, but at least for me, it's a real good time. Well, those were just a few of the Nintendo games that I would consider forgotten. There's a lot more that I could talk about, but I think I'm gonna save them for another time. Until then though, I'll catch you guys later. I'm gonna go see if Muddy wants to hang out.